Welcome back to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. We're diving into some seriously fascinating Islamic ideas. Today we're talking about Imam al-Ghazali, specifically how he explores the idea of worship. Ibadah.
Even centuries later, it's incredible how his work still speaks to anyone who's looking for a deeper spiritual life, especially his thoughts on Ibadah. He goes way beyond the usual stuff we think of when we hear that word.
Yeah, definitely not just praying 5 times a day, right? The sources we're looking at today, things like the remembrance of death, marvels of the heart, on disciplining the self, and fi kasira. What struck me was how al-Ghazali connects worship to, well, everything, how we live, even how we think.
Oh, absolutely. And to really get that, we should start with how he sees death. He calls it a precious gift for believers.
Okay, that's a little different. I mean, we usually fear death, right?
Yeah, exactly. But al-Ghazali wants us to totally flip that. He argues, for someone truly devoted to God, this life, it's like a cage. It traps the soul. Death, then, it becomes the key, unlocks the soul's true potential, lets it return to its source.
So less about, cheering for death itself, more about understanding that real life, the true reunion with the divine that's beyond this world.
Exactly, and once you realize that, it pushes you towards sincere worship. Makes sense, right? If death is a passage to something greater, we better spend our time preparing for that trip.
It's like packing for a trip you've been waiting forever for. You wouldn't fill your bag with junk, would you? You bring stuff that'll sustain you in that new place.
Perfect analogy. Al-Ghazali actually compares this world to a prison. Death is the prisoner's release. But yeah, the point's the same. He's saying every single thing we do, even think, it can be preparation for what's next.
Reminds me of that story about Hudayfa. He was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. When death came, he wasn't afraid, welcomed it like an old friend.
Ah, yes, it shows how powerful it is to, really get this idea of death. Hudayfa understood death wasn't an end, but a beginning, a transition to something way bigger, a meeting with the beloved God.
And since we mentioned the Prophet, al-Ghazali talks about one of his sayings, he who recalls death 20 times in one day and night gets the reward of a martyr. Pretty intense, right? Martyrdom's a huge deal in Islam.
Huge. In Islam, a martyr is someone who dies defending their faith, the ultimate sacrifice, and they have a special place in the afterlife.
So is al-Ghazali saying just thinking about death gives you the same, spiritual rank as someone who died in battle? Seems a little extreme.
Well, not literally the same, obviously, but he's drawing a parallel. It's about sacrifice. A martyr gives their life. The person remembering death, they're giving up their attachment to the world, to desires, those fleeting pleasures that distract us from God.
A kind of spiritual martyrdom, then. You choose to detach from all the stuff pulling you away from God.
Exactly. That detachment, that constant awareness of our mortality, it becomes like a foundation for real, sincere worship. It helps us prioritize, to make choices that line up with our goal of returning to God.
Like hitting a reset button in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
You remember death, you remember the bigger picture, and all those little worries, all those desires, they lose their power.
That's a great way to put it. And al-Ghazali doesn't just talk about this theoretically. He gives us examples, like the sermon by Umar ibn al-Aziz. He was a righteous caliph, really stressed the importance of preparing for the afterlife. He said our provisions should be fear of God.
Whoa, intense sermon. Tell me more.
Umar ibn Abdulaziz, he really wanted his listeners to picture it, the rewards and punishments of the afterlife, to feel the fear and the longing as they went through this temporary world, like had already seen the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, talk about motivation. Like he's saying, hey, don't get caught up in the small stuff. Focus on what matters because time's running out.
Exactly. This life is fleeting. Every moment's a chance to gather those provisions for the hereafter. And what are those provisions? Right actions, sincere intentions, a heart full of fear and love for God.
Okay, so we're starting to see how this idea of death connects to al-Ghazali's Ibadah.
Mm-hmm.
But there's more, right? He talks about the human heart itself, how it connects to the divine.
Right. In Marvels of the Heart, he says the heart has two doors. One opens to the physical world. That's through our senses, how we usually experience things. The other door, that opens to the alam al-malakut, the world of spirits, a realm we can't see with our physical eyes.
So not just the physical heart, right? This heart is spiritual too. It's how we connect to a higher reality.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The physical world, it's just a reflection, a shadow of something deeper, something more real. Our senses only see the reflection, right? But the heart, if it's pure, if it's receptive, it can open to the source itself.
Okay, I'm following, but this alam al-malakut, this world of spirits, I need more. What exactly is it?
Think of it as a realm of pure spiritual reality, beyond our senses, where knowledge and events unfold differently than here in ways we can't totally grasp. It's connected to the law al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. It's believed to hold everything, all knowledge and events, past, present, future, all divinely recorded.
So al-Ghazali saying true knowledge, true understanding, it doesn't just come from our experiences here. It comes from this connection to the alam al-Ma.
Yes, he calls it divine inspiration, ilham ilahi. It's wisdom, guidance, flowing right into the heart when that inner door is open.
It's like that analogy with the sun, right? You can see its reflection in a puddle,
Yeah.
but that's not the sun.
Exactly. Our senses are like the puddle. They only show a limited view, an indirect one. To really experience that divine knowledge, that ilham ilahi, you got to go beyond what your senses tell you. You got to open the heart's door.
Okay, so how? How do we open that door to the al-Malakut? It's not like there's a handle or anything.
That's where purification's super important. Al-Ghazali says a heart full of negativity, impurities like envy, greed, arrogance is like a dusty mirror. Divine light can't get through all that grime.
We got to clean the heart then, polish it, so we can reflect that divine light.
You got it. And it's not a one-time thing, it's ongoing, constantly purifying our intentions, our thoughts, our actions, getting rid of anything that blocks that connection to the deeper reality.
So we need this purification not just for true Ibadah, but for that ilham ilahi too.
Exactly. He has this interesting analogy. He says our senses are like water trapped in a reservoir.
Ah, so like the reservoir keeps the water from like bursting out from the earth. So being stuck on the physical world, stuck in our senses, blocks the divine inspiration from coming in.
You got it. We're so focused on the container, we forget about the source.
So we gotta shift our focus from outside to inside, from senses to spirit, cultivating an inner state that's ready for the divine.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big part of al-Ghazali's Ibadah, jihadi nafs, the struggle against your lower self.
Okay, that's something I always find interesting, but honestly a little scary too. This inner battle, wrestling with your desires, constant tug of war, right?
It is. He believed our lower self, the nafs, wants us to indulge in those things that boost our ego, our desires, those basic instincts, wants comfort, pleasure, recognition, all that stuff that distracts us from, what we're really here for.
So for sincere Ibadah, got to be on guard all the time, fighting that nafs.
Kind of, but it's not about denying those desires completely. It's more about understanding them, channeling them in a way that lines up with our bigger goals, with God's will.
So less robot, more about like refining our desires, turning them into something that fits our spiritual goals.
You got it. And he stresses that reason and divine law, those are key in this struggle.
Okay, so how do those fit in?
Well, reason helps us figure out right from wrong, to understand what our choices will lead to. And then we can choose what's truly good for us, both in this world and the next. We think beyond just what feels good right now and consider the long term.
So less impulsivity, more thinking things through.
Exactly. And then divine law from the Quran and the Prophet's teachings, it gives us the ethical framework, the guidelines to live a life God's pleased with. It's the roadmap, shows us the path to spiritual fulfillment.
Use our brain power, guided by divine law. Make choices that are good for our souls, not just for whatever we're craving at the moment.
Exactly. True freedom isn't indulging every whim. It's about mastering yourself, aligning your actions with your higher purpose.
And then there's this story about Ibrahim Adam, right?
Yeah.
The king who gave up all his wealth and status for a more spiritual life, right?
Yes. Ibrahim Adam's story perfectly shows what it means to prioritize your spiritual goals. He had it all. Palaces, riches, power. But he realized none of it brought real happiness or fulfillment.
Like the ultimate minimalist. Gave up luxury to focus on God.
Exactly. He saw how empty worldly stuff was, chose to devote himself to seeking closeness with God, ditched his palaces, gave away his riches, embraced austerity and devotion.
Takes serious willpower, especially coming from that kind of background. What made him change so drastically?
Al-Ghazali says he had a massive spiritual awakening. There are a few versions, but one's about him hunting in the woods. Then a voice calls out, asking him, "What are you doing?" reminding him of his true purpose.
Wow, talk about a reality check. That shook him up and made him rethink his whole life.
Exactly. It was like a lightning bolt. He suddenly realized he was wasting time on fleeting pleasures, ignoring his spiritual duties. It was like he was seeing the world with new eyes. And his old life had no appeal anymore.
His story really shows how transformative self-discipline can be. real wealth, real happiness. It's not about the stuff you own. It's about spiritual richness.
Exactly. And Ibrahim Anham shows us that to reach that richness, we got to make hard choices, even sacrifices, letting go of things that hold us back from God, even if they look tempting.
Like he's saying, you can have all the money in the world, but if your heart's empty, you have nothing.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you can be simple, even poor, but if your heart's full of love for God, then you have everything that truly matters.
So we see how al-Ghazali connect all these ideas. Awareness of death, purifying the heart, disciplining the self. They're all part of sincere ibadah. But he doesn't stop there, right? He brings in the Prophet Muhammad's life as the ultimate example.
Absolutely. Al-Ghazali uses Fiqh Sira to explore how the Prophet's life was the perfect example of worship and submission to God's will.
So what can we learn from the Prophet's example when it comes to ibadah?
Well, one thing that stands out is his total, absolute surrender to God's will. And it wasn't blind obedience either. It came from a deep understanding of God's wisdom, mercy, and love.
It's like having deep trust, knowing that God's plan is for our own good, even if we don't always see it right away.
Exactly. And that trust fueled everything the Prophet did, his actions, his choices, his whole way of being. Al-Ghazali points to a verse in the Quran that emphasizes this link between understanding, reflection, and action. It says, "And we have revealed to you the remembrance of the Quran, so that you may explain to people that which has been revealed for them, and that perhaps they may reflect."
So don't just passively listen to the Quran.
Yeah.
You got to actively engage with it, think about what it means, then actually live it out.
Exactly. The Prophet didn't just hear the Quran. He pondered it, took it all in, and then lived those teachings in every part of his life.
This is like what we were talking about before, about the heart's two doors. The Prophet was able to open that inner door and get the Quran's message not just with his mind, but with his whole being.
That's beautiful. And his life shows us how we can approach the Quran, too. It's not just a book to read, it's a guide, an inspiration, something that can change us.
Al-Ghazali talks about a story about the Prophet that shows just how strong his commitment to God was. It's the one where he refused all the power and riches the Quraysh offered him.
Yes, that story really shows what mattered most to the Prophet. The Quraysh, they were desperate to stop Islam from spreading. So they offered him everything: money, leadership, even a kingdom, if he'd just stop preaching.
But he said no, right? Even though it would have made his life easier, more comfortable.
Absolutely. He knew true power doesn't come from ruling a country. It comes from submitting to God. He was willing to sacrifice everything, comfort, status, even his tribe's safety, to uphold Islam and keep worshiping God alone.
That shows some serious conviction. He wasn't tempted by the things that would sway most people.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali says that following the Prophet's example, both what he did and his inner devotion, that's a huge part of sincere ibadah.
So less about copying specific things he did, more about trying to have the same mindset, that same connection to God.
Exactly. It's about having those qualities that made the Prophet so amazing: his compassion, humility, his rock-solid faith, and letting those things guide us.
This is so much to think about. Al-Ghazali's exploration of Ibadah, it has so many layers. It weaves together all these parts of spiritual practice and changing yourself. It's clear worship isn't just a bunch of rituals to him. It's how you live your whole life.
Absolutely. And we've just scratched the surface. He goes even deeper, talking about Ihsan. That takes this idea of worship to a whole new level.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's hear what Al-Ghazali has to say about Ihsan and how it helps us understand Ibadah even better.
It's amazing how Al-Ghazali brings together so many different ideas in Islam, like remembering death, how the heart connects to the unseen world, self-discipline, and it all leads to the example of the Prophet Muhammad. It shows how his approach to ibadah, to worship, has so many sides.
Like a tapestry, right?
Yeah,
Every thread makes the whole picture richer, more complex. He doesn't just tell us to worship. He gives us a way to understand what it means.
exactly. And that framework, it goes beyond your personal connection to God. It includes how you interact with the whole world. He talks about Ihsan. People translate that as excellence or perfection, but it's deeper than that.
He says it's like worshiping God as if you see him, right? But even if you can't quite get to that level, you should always know he sees you.
Exactly. Ihsan means bringing that awareness of God into everything you do, knowing your actions are always witnessed, so you try to do everything with sincerity, beauty, excellence, as if God himself is watching.
So living a life that pleases God, not just in rituals, but in how you treat people, your thoughts, your intentions, everything.
Exactly. It's like being mindful all the time, knowing you're always in God's presence. That makes even ordinary things into worship. Think about how that could change your life.
Like turning your whole life into a prayer. Every act, even small ones, becomes a way to connect with God.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's making your life sacred, seeing God in everything. Like when you eat, you can think about the blessings you have, thanking God for giving you food. When you work, you do it with care and honesty, seeing your effort as worship.
So Ihsan isn't just about what you do. It's about that inner awareness, always connected to God.
Absolutely. Knowing God isn't far away. He's involved in every part of your life. And when you understand that, it changes everything. It makes you want to be better, do everything with excellence.
Al-Ghazali also talks about following the Prophet Muhammad's example to reach Ihsan. Can you tell us more about that?
Of course. The Prophet Muhammad, he was the perfect example of Ihsan. His life, his actions, his words, everything about him reflected this deep awareness of God. He treated everyone with compassion, even his enemies. He saw the divine spark in every person.
He was known for being humble, generous, always standing up for justice and truth. He didn't just talk about it, he lived it.
Exactly. His life is like a blueprint for how we can have Ihsan too. We try to be like him, do the things he did, have that same way of being in the world. For example, he was famous for being patient and forgiving, even when things were tough. We can try to be like that too, facing challenges with grace instead of getting angry or resentful.
So it's not just doing the same actions, it's about cultivating that same inner state, that connection to God that guided him.
You got it. It's about embodying those qualities that made him so special. His compassion, humility, unwavering faith, and letting those guide our thoughts, intentions, and actions. The closer we get to those, the closer we get to Ihsan.
So how does this connect back to worship? How does striving for Ihsan change how we see Ibadah?
When you aim for Ihsan, when you always feel that divine presence, worship becomes more than rituals. It's your whole life. Every action, every thought, every interaction becomes sacred. It's like this. We don't just pray 5 times a day. We live our entire lives as a prayer.
Worship isn't just for certain times and places, it's everything.
Exactly. It means knowing you're always worshiping, whether you're praying, working, talking to people, or just looking at creation. Your intention is what matters. Even washing dishes, you can do it mindfully, thinking of it as purifying not just your dishes, but your heart, stuck in traffic. Use that time to reflect or remember God instead of getting frustrated.
So worship becomes much bigger than what we usually think. It's active, it's part of every day.
Absolutely. And al-Ghazali says this is how you get close to God. Realizing that every moment is a chance to connect with the divine, be grateful, become a better person, and get closer to your purpose. He even says sometimes struggling with a tough task, being patient and asking God for help, that can be more meaningful worship than doing a ritual perfectly, but without really feeling it.
That brings up another important thing Al-Ghazali talks about, self-reflection. It's like that's the key to making sure what we do matches what we want spiritually.
Yes, self-reflection is crucial. You need it to see your weaknesses, know what to improve, and make sure your actions line up with your spiritual goals. It's looking inside yourself, checking your motives, honestly figuring out where you stand with God.
It's like looking in a mirror, really seeing your soul. Do your actions show the qualities you want? Are your intentions pure? Are you trying to be the best you can be?
Exactly. It's about being really self-aware, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, always trying to purify your heart and be a better person. But it's not about beating yourself up or obsessing over your flaws. It's about knowing you're not perfect, but still striving to grow closer to God.
Al-Ghazali talks about a powerful way to practice self-reflection, remembering death. We talked about this before, but it seems really important to his whole idea of worship.
Right. He says remembering death isn't about being morbid or dwelling on the negative. It's about realizing that this life is temporary. Using that to motivate yourself to live with purpose. It's about knowing your time is limited so you don't waste it.
He actually says we should think about death many times a day. He even compares it to the reward of a martyr, like we talked about before. Seems kind of strange finding motivation in thinking about dying.
Might seem that way at first, but think of it like this. When you really understand death, it helps you focus on what's truly important. All of a sudden, those little annoyances, those fleeting desires, wanting material things, it all seems less important. You realize what really matters is your connection with God and what you leave behind.
So thinking about death reminds us how important our spiritual journey is. It pushes us to focus on worshiping and living in a way that pleases God.
Exactly. You realize your time is precious, so you don't waste it on pointless things that distract you from your true purpose. Instead, you focus on things that'll benefit you in this life and the next.
Al-Ghazali also says we need to purify our hearts when we're reflecting on ourselves. We talked about purifying the heart for Ilahi, but it's important for self-reflection too, right?
Yes, he says our hearts are where our intentions and actions come from. If they're full of envy, greed, arrogance, or other spiritual problems, our worship will be messed up. Our actions won't match our spiritual goals. It's like trying to see through a dirty window. You can't see clearly, so you can't judge yourself or the world accurately.
So we have to clean those negative things out and cultivate good things like humility, compassion, and gratitude. Those seem to be the foundation for sincere worship and honest self-reflection.
Exactly. It's about creating a space inside where the divine light can come in and help you understand. Imagine polishing that window until it shines, so light flows through easily. Then you see yourself and your actions more clearly, more honestly.
Like preparing the soil so the seeds of true worship can grow.
Beautiful analogy. And al-Ghazali gives practical advice for purifying the heart. He talks about having good company, being around people who uplift you. He says charity is important, being generous to those in need, and reciting the Quran, letting its words cleanse your heart.
So actively doing things that feed your soul and help you develop qualities that bring you closer to God.
Absolutely. And these aren't just external rituals, they have an inner effect too. Like fasting, it's not just about not eating or drinking, it's about self-control, realizing you depend on God, and feeling empathy for those who don't have enough.
And he talks about sincere repentance too,
Yeah.
right? Admitting your mistakes and asking God for forgiveness.
Yes, repentance is crucial for purifying the heart. It's realizing you did wrong, feeling true remorse, and deciding to avoid those mistakes. It clears away the baggage of your past and makes room for spiritual growth, like weeding a garden, getting rid of things that stop beautiful flowers from growing.
So doing those spiritual practices that help you improve your character and develop qualities that God loves.
Absolutely. It's constantly trying to get better, a lifelong journey of getting closer and closer to God.
This brings us back to what al-Ghazali is really saying.
Yeah.
Ibadah, worship, isn't just the outward stuff. It's about that inner awareness, that heart connection with God that affects everything you do.
Yes, it's about aligning your thoughts, intentions, and actions with God's will. Realizing every moment is a chance to show your gratitude, improve yourself, and get closer to your ultimate purpose.
It's about making your whole life an act of worship.
Well said. Al-Ghazali's exploration of all these ideas, from remembering death to purifying the heart to following the Prophet Muhammad's example, gives us a deep and inspiring understanding of what it means to live a life devoted to worship.
It's interesting how al-Ghazali focuses on both sides of worship, the interpersonal part, and how that affects, well, how you act in the world.
Absolutely. He's clear that real worship should show in your actions, in being ethical, taking social responsibility, working for justice and compassion, like when you drop a stone in water, the ripples spread out. That's what our devotion should do, create positive change in our communities and beyond.
Okay, but what does that look like? What are some ways our worship should actually affect what we do?
Al-Ghazali gives some examples. Like, he talks a lot about honesty, being trustworthy in everything, business, personal stuff, even just casual talk.
He says, always tell the truth and stay away from gossip, putting people down, spreading lies. It's about understanding how strong words are and using them to build up, not tear down.
Right. He reminds us our words, they can really hurt, or they can do a lot of good, like a double-edged sword, you know?
Yeah.
We got to be careful with them, make sure what we say matches our faith.
Makes me think of that saying from the Prophet Muhammad, whoever believes in God in the last day should speak good or remain silent. Powerful reminder to be mindful of what you say. Use your words in a way that benefits people and pleases God.
Exactly. That saying sums up what Al-Ghazali's talking about. And it's not just avoiding big lies. It's also about stuff like backbiting, talking bad about someone when they're not around. Think about it. If everyone actually did this, how much more peaceful things would be.
Yeah, it'd be a huge shame. We're so used to gossip and negativity, right?
Yeah.
Living up to that standard of truthful speech, that takes work, a real effort to make our conversations better.
It would. But imagine how much better our relationships would be, our communities, even our own peace of mind. When you commit to honesty and kindness, you're not just helping other people, you're purifying your own heart, becoming more genuine.
Al-Ghazali doesn't stop there either. He also talks about keeping your promises, honoring your obligations. It's about showing people you're reliable, that they can trust you.
Oh, absolutely. Breaking a promise, that's a big deal to him. He says you should only promise what you'll actually do. And you should work hard to keep those promises, even if it's inconvenient or you have to sacrifice. Imagine if we took all our agreements, big or small, that seriously.
Things would be different, right? There'd be so much more trust in our relationships, knowing we could count on each other to do what we said we'd do.
Exactly. And this goes beyond just personal stuff. It's about business, communities, even our relationship with God. When you promise something to God, whether it's a vow or just a commitment to live right, you got to be sincere about keeping it.
This brings us to another big idea al-Ghazali connects to worship: social justice. He believes that if your worship is real, you have to help make society fair and just.
Yes, he's against all kinds of oppression and injustice. Doesn't matter if it's because of race, religion, social status, anything. He says believers have to speak up when things are wrong, defend those who are mistreated, and try to build a society where everyone's treated with dignity and respect.
He sees fighting for justice as part of worship, showing God's mercy and compassion to the world, recognizing that every person has value, and building a world where that's reflected.
Exactly. He's challenging us. Don't just be good in private. Go out and make the world better, fairer. Your worship shouldn't stay on your prayer rug. It should go out and make things better.
It's like that saying from Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph:
Yeah.
injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Shows how our actions are all connected and how we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Powerful quote. And it gets right to al-Ghazali's point. He's telling us to pay attention, notice injustice, and speak up. Even small acts of kindness make a difference. Helping a neighbor, defending someone, just treating everyone with respect. We can all build a world that reflects God's justice and mercy.
And al-Ghazali really stresses kindness and compassion. He says those are essential for true worship. Even little acts of kindness matter.
Yeah.
It's seeing how connected we all are and helping whenever you can.
Absolutely. He says be generous with your time, your resources. Always look for chances to help people. The way you treat others shows your relationship with God.
So if you're harsh, judgmental, unkind, it shows you don't really get God's mercy and compassion, right? Like you're failing to show those same qualities in your own life.
Exactly. He's saying, see the divine in everyone, know that we're all linked, and how you treat others shows how well you understand God. Think about it. If we all interacted like that, with that awareness, how much kinder and more understanding we'd be.
So al-Ghazali's view of worship is really complete. It's your personal connection to God, but it also affects how you act, your character, how you interact with everyone.
Exactly. He blends the inner and outer parts of worship perfectly, showing that true devotion to God should naturally lead to ethical actions, taking care of your community, and trying to make the world better.
Like he's saying, your worship should make you a better person, not just when you're alone, but when you're out in the world too.
Beautifully put. He's telling us to be God's qualities, show his mercy, compassion, justice, and love in everything you do. It's a challenge, but it's also inspiring, this vision of what a life of worship can be.
This has been such an insightful look at how al-Ghazali sees worship. It's so much bigger than rituals and prayers. It's about how you live, always trying to follow God's will, embody the qualities that bring you closer to him.
Absolutely. Al-Ghazali gives us a map, a set of principles, a vision for what worshiping can look like. But the real work, the change, it happens inside each person. It's taking these ideas and using them in your own life, letting them shape your choices and how you treat others.
It's a journey of self-discovery, of spiritual growth, always striving for the divine. It takes effort, dedication, but it's worth it. You get more peace, deeper connections with people, and a real sense of purpose.
Well said. As we keep exploring al-Ghazali's work, thinking about his wisdom, we might find that the very things he explains end up changing us too.
This deep dive into how al-Ghazali understands worship has been amazing. It reminds us that Ibadah isn't just about going through the motions. It's about that connection with God in your heart, affecting every part of your life. It's a call to show God's qualities in what we do, strive to be the best we can be, and work towards a more just and compassionate world. Thanks for joining us, and may we all keep learning and growing in our understanding of what it means to live for God.